never record to the computer. I made that mistake. I'll explain some. You don't have enough space, and so it only records the audio, and you cannot get the video back.
Okay.
All right, so it says it's recording.
All right, good luck.
All right. So hi, I'm back at 12:45 here after lunch. And as you probably know by now, I'm at home doing this for you because I surprised myself. I tested myself this morning and I have COVID. So I can't be with you. So trying to here do a pinch hit. So my lab manager, Cody, is helping me, and hopefully we'll get somewhere with this one. So my talk, the second talk is similar to my first. So you're going to say to your neighbor, she said the same thing. It's subtle difference, because what I'm trying to show you is I want you to understand that life history patterns make a huge difference. And I told you in the first one, we're going to talk about clear-wing borers. And these are very common in Minnesota. They're in everything. Ash trees, viburnum, oak trees. For some reason, we are oblivious to them. They look like cankers from a weed whacker. And the moths are attracted to lay their eggs in cankers from a weed whacker. But they destroy the tree and kill it, the shrub, and there's no going back. So on the left there, you see Zimmerman pine moth, and you see those yellow branches. And that's what we all associate with either the roots rotting from being in water or an insect in the stem. And the thing is that clear-wing borers would do the exact same thing until they kill the whole plant. So the point of this talk is to tell you that even though you think, oh, the plant is all dead, you have a preconceived idea why you don't until you start looking into what insect could do it, or is it abiotic? So this talk is trying to stress how insect damage and abiotic damage is so similar that you have to work. So when an insect is damaging a plant, the first thing you're going to find is frass, poop. And you see here, this is insect poop. Here's the larvae. It's tunneling in the bark. It's eating the heartwood. The viburnum has been pulled out of the ground. Very common at the Arboretum. Hard to grow viburnums out there. Imidacloprid doesn't work. You have to inject nematodes. You can try spraying the bark, but the adults are out the whole summer. And the bark protection with, we talked about this before, tallstar bifenthrin or permethrin astro, doesn't last very long. And so you'd have to do it a couple of times. We used to use chlorpyrifos, but that's been banned. You can use it in nursery, but you can't use it in landscape. So you do have two choices for clear-wing borer: Astra, which is permethrin, or Onyx, which is bifenthrin, and you spray it on the bark. So how do you know that this and this, what's going on? Well, the first thing you go is trying to find out the frass. Clear-wing borers are most of the time in the trunk. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be up here on a branch, but you will see this significant canker and damage if you have a clear-wing borer. And I'm going to show you pictures. If you have a Zimmerman pine moth, you're going to just see little, it's under the bark, but they don't do as much damage. The Arboretum, it took them years to figure out about the Zimmerman pine moth. Scientists have tried to figure out, when they're out, when the adults are laying eggs, and there's like 5 species. They all look alike. We've made no headway in projecting when Zimmerman pine moth adults might be out laying eggs. So you got to basically look for the damage, and then you basically have to use a spray on the trunk for the next year, or kind of dig them out if you can and put nematodes or Bavaria in the gallery. And that is the only way. It is hard to bring back a plant from a clear-wing borer. So this is my summary that is in your booklet. Climate change, drought, too much water, all interact with insects and disease to create outbreaks. Red velvet patches on maple trees or protrusions on ash flowers are mite galls, which cannot be managed and do not harm the tree. Brown spots on turf are usually considered Japanese beetle damage in Minnesota, but is much more likely to be a fungus or an environmental condition. We will discuss the changing pest issues in Minnesota. So it's going to be similar to my first talk, but we're going to be stressing on damage and how you figure out who is damaging. So just to start out, I have these two websites I've worked on nonstop for 20 years. Nobody visits them because I don't think anybody knows they're there. I talk to you once a year. This is kind of an obligatory meeting. I think all of you are just happy to get home. You don't remember. But there are two great websites for you to have information about diagnosing good bugs from bad bugs. And in the first talk, we talked about it's good to diagnose what is a wasp that's going to attack people and pets from what is a simple little ground nesting bee that won't do any damage. Ground nesting bees get inside the wood or inside herbaceous stems of perennials. That's why we say do not cut down stems until the following May, end of May, because that's where a lot of these native bees. I have this beautiful rose, my favorite color, orange, coral orange, to remind you that when a rose has this tight little bud, like most modern roses do, you can't see the pollen and nectar. So if you do use imidacloprid, you don't have to anymore. We have plenty of biorationals. It's probably not going to kill a pollinator because there's nothing, they can't get into the flower head. You'll see the Japanese beetles with their long spiny legs are pushing to get down in there to eat pollen. So we talked about this in Menards and Home Depot. You see these structures with these straws, and they're really good. We put some out at 4 parks, and they were all infested by the end of the first season. We were so surprised. The problem is they also get infested by the biocontrol of these stem nesting bees. And so you have to change them out every summer, probably the end of June, somewhere in June. And so here you see a leaf stuck in there. They stick twigs in there. Here is an adult going in and out. And so you need the structure, but every year you want to put new stems in. And I talked to you about retrofitting landscapes with all kinds of different wild bird foods. Especially I'm concerned about losing our beautiful hummingbirds. This is a native plant called Campsis radicans. If you went to the U, it grew on the side of the Hort building, the greenhouses. And when they changed this structure and they put new wood in that was full of arsenic, it killed it. So it used to go up to the roof. It was an amazing plant. Now it's just really small. And this is Dropmore scarlet. These are the two plants that the hummingbirds can feed on. You need feeders. They come north feeding on the sapsucker holes. Sapsuckers are disappearing, so they're not making holes. And the eastern population disappeared really early on in like 1995. And I have a feeling our population, every year I get less and less in my backyard. So please try to use rain gardens, use native gardens, bee lawns. And when you can plant herbaceous plants, think of planting things that are hummingbird food. And here is this leaf cutter bee. If you see these, we talked about this. It's not a big deal. They're never going to kill the plant. It's just a few holes. They're only out for 2 weeks. So here are the websites. If any of your colleagues need information for the license, every spring MNLA and I do an online course and in-person course teaching everything you know in the A&E book. So please refer people at your industry to that. So here's the pollinator conservation website. Here's the IPM for greenhouse. I pointed out, this is discontinued. I point out, it talks about all the pesticides registered, compatibility of pesticides with good bugs, where you can download a label in case you destroy your label. And this is really important. It tells you those insecticides that are compatible with biocontrol. And here's a link in case where you're managing, you find rusty patch bumblebee, you have to contact the MD and DNR and come up with a management plan that won't hurt rusty patch bumblebee. You can still manage the landscape, just slightly different ways. And there's this book online and it has all these links. You just click on this. We talked about in the introduction, maple, velvet, erinium gall, this mite on the leaf that you don't have to manage. It's a gall in there. We talked about in the introduction, ash flower gall mite. It's right in the book. You can just click on that. You learn the life history, when to manage it, what pesticide to use. So you do have the information. I've made it all at your disposal. So please check it out. And this is just one page from the pollinators, which shows you what nests in the ground, that's a little native bee, what nests in stems. So there is plenty of information for you. This website talks about what IPM is, how to develop an IPM program if you have an endangered species. The only ones you're going to bump into is rusty patch bumblebee and monarchs. Remember, rusty patch bumblebee is endangered. Monarchs is not on the endangered species list, but they're trying to put it up there. There's resources for you to download. You can put this poster up. And there's a butterfly gardening booklet that won an award from the American Society of Horticultural Sciences that is just beautiful. My first one was in 1998, and this is a redo in 2020. So that is the resources. They're there. Please go there and look at them. Again, what is IPM? It's a decision-making process to reduce risk. It's information-based. It's biologically based. It's site-specific to the pests. So if you have a Christmas tree farm, or you're growing you're growing spruce in a nursery, or if you have spruce in a backyard, you're going to manage it differently. And this website helps you come up with those management tactics. If it's a backyard, you can do cultural management. You can water more. You could add micronutrients to the soil. You could add compost. Plant roots love compost. They don't like plastic turf like we used to do years ago. You put down a piece of plastic and then you put mulch on top. No, don't do that. Put down a little fertilizer to help up the nitrogen in the soil because the microorganisms are going to take out the nitrogen. Put your mulch down and that mulch will become higher in fungal biomass compared to bacterial biomass. There's been studies all over the country in the last 20 years looking at gradients from urban forests to rural forests and what is the major difference in plant growth. It has to do with the soils. And what's in the soil? In a high put nitrogen environment like a backyard or municipal area around a building, they use a lot of nitrogen. Those fertilizers you use for turf or what, 20-30% nitrogen is really high. You get that on the roots of a conifer growing under the grass. You're pumping it in. The plant grows faster and it causes bacteria to grow in the soil rather than fungi. So all these things now you hear about these additives to the soil, worm casting, micronutrients, mycorrhizal. All of these are attempts to increase the vitality of the soil so that it protects the roots better. So we're going to talk about that in a minute, how to diagnose the plants that are dying of a root disease versus a borer. But I can tell you a lot of our urban plants, you put, for instance, yews that are foundation plants, you put them in around a house, nobody fertilizes them, nobody adds calcium, nobody adds anything. How do you expect? It's just sucking all the nutrients out of the soil. People don't put leaves underneath to decompose. They, for some reason, take that black gold, those leaves, and throw them away. You should be stuffing them under your shrubs so they decompose. So if you don't want leaves, then you're going to have to spend some money on all these new soil additives. And that is what makes organic growing conditions different than conventional agriculture. Is organic production is focused on increasing the soil texture, the micronutrients in the soil. All of this is to make the soil dominated by fungi, which is plant friendly, and reduce bacterial loads. So when you develop an IPM program, you use all these tactics. Cultural would be increasing the soil. Physical might be something like putting up hoop covers on your tomatoes or something. Genetic would be using plants that are resistant. The easiest example we've tried to get resistant American elms to Dutch elm disease. It didn't work. We tried to get resistant chestnuts to chestnut blight. It didn't work. We tried to develop American ash resistance to Erwinia. It didn't work. So the best we have right now for genetic is the crab apples that are resistant, semi-resistant to scab. Then there's biological control, which is what we want to promote in urban landscapes and turf. Woody plants is natural enemies, predators like wolves, ladybird beetles. They eat many larvae in their lifetimes, parasitoids that lay their eggs in a host, so you get one egg in a host, and diseases, pathogens. that are host specific to the pest. You notice chemical control is last, and then it should be spot treated. So if you have problems with Canadian thistle, spot treat. We're trying really to make you rethink this herbicide. There's a number of papers out there showing herbicides are detrimental to native and managed bees. I myself, I'm out there after I installed 16 in 2 plots on the campus, 8 bumblebee nests in each. They come and they spray with the herbicide. The bees make it back to the nursery cloth and all die. So I myself know that herbicides are killing bees. If you use pesticides, use the least toxic first, which is we call these biorational pesticides, and use conventional. So you have a chance in an urban environment to use less pesticides. And basically what you do is you sell your business to consumers. Don't want pesticides. They don't want the dog exposed. They don't want the cat exposed, the kids. And so they want you to use less pesticides. So come up with a little promotional bulletin, print it at FedEx, and talk about how you're managing with biorational insecticides. You're scouting, you're doing IPM, multiple tactics, all so you don't have to manage with pesticides. And all of that management will conserve good bugs. So again, avoid over-fertilization, use these micro-fertilizer, micronutrients, practice IPM, and install all these different kinds of bee lawns, rain gardens, to provide plants with pollen and nectar. So you heard this before. All of this works. No broadcast treatments, spot treatments. Save money with herbicides by putting micronutrients. Promote bee lawns and decrease herbicide. And here's an ad for a bee lawn from the state of Minnesota is spending a lot of money trying to get people to grow clover again, which fixes nitrogen in lawns, so it adds nitrogen. Any herbicide you use is going to kill all that clover. So we really are trying to change that paradigm from a monoculture of some grasses into a polyculture with native flowers and with clovers. I talked to you this before, but again, Rusty Patch Bumblebee Watch, you can take a picture with your phone. You can send it off. And if you are managing the area with Rusty Patch, you have to go to the DNR and the MDA and come up with a management plan. All right, so this talk is diagnosing environmental conditions. So telling insect from pathogen damage. Insect pests can be grouped according to where they damage the plant. We talked about that previously, that the families of insects damage the plants in different ways, remember? And that by knowing the family of insects, you're going to understand more what's damaging the plant and how to predict when to manage it. When you apply some treatment, whether it's cultural. We're going to talk a lot about cultural treatments for borers, because with climate change, that is going to be the big one. Insects that vector diseases are the most damaging, and insects that remove leaf tissue are the least. So that little native bee that scoops out those little circular patches from the rose plants, lays an egg on it, stuffs some pollen in there, sticks it in the ground or in a stem. That is nothing. That's no issue. The issue that you have is like this Erwinia. So this is vectored by honeybees. It kills the rosaceous plants. American ash, that makes those big red berries that are obvious this time of the year. When a honeybee vectors it on its body from an infected plant, it gets in the pollen in infected plants. A plant will die in 2 weeks, and it's called bacterial rot. And from the tip, it starts to grow down, the tips turn black, and eventually the whole plant. And that is, I have watched this over and over again. American ash is my favorite. It's a host plant in the fall for the birds that migrate. Those are the waxwings, the 2 species, cedar and Bohemian waxwing. And we're losing it from our landscape. We don't have a lot of fall berries. We don't have much ilex, much holly winterberry. So that was a good fall plant, and it's disappearing. Remember, pathogen damage, insect damage, abiotic damage, they can all look the same. And what I keep hammering is insect evolution is very conservative. So if you know the family of the insect, then most insects in that family perform similar kinds of damage. So what is this? You look at that. I don't know what it is. I mean, I would like to say, oh yeah, I know that arborvitae or spruce on the left, that is a borer down in the trunk, or it's armillaria, it's a fungus. Or that is kind of weird, that other picture, every other one is dying. What is that about? But until I start scouting and pulling apart the plant and looking, I don't have an idea. I know when a plant is brown like that, it's affecting the vascular connections, that food and nutrients aren't going up. So something's in the trunk. But it can be root damage. It can be bark damage from hares or rabbits in the winter. It can be armillaria fungus, very common in Minnesota on the lower bark of conifers. It can be a borer insect. So there are no fast rules on how for you to diagnose damage from bark beetles or damage from roots or abiotic damage. You got to get in there and look. I'm going to tell you right away, if I saw this, I would say armillaria. There's a bark borer down, northern pine weevil. There's something down by the soil surface in the bark. That's affecting the movement of nutrients up and down. If I look at this, I would say, look how high these root balls are. Whoever planted this, well, they have no concept of plants. Well, the roots, which are the heart of the plant, are exposed to heat and light. That is a death sentence. So my question is, why aren't all 5 of them dead? Why are just 2 of them dead? So again, you have to investigate what is going on. There is no, until you start looking for damage, you start looking for pathogen conidia, you start looking for abiotic. This is an abiotic issue. Don't go beyond this. This is your issue here. So birch trees, some of you know this, some of you don't. Iron chlorosis. Birch trees like to be in forests. They don't want to be in your lawn. Their roots are close to the surface. They dry out in the heat. And so they are used to being an they're used to be in acid soils. Most of Minnesota's alkaline soils. Our soils are river bottom soils from the glacier, from a big inland ocean. It's not acidic, which are old soils. And so acidic soils allow the movement of nutrients. Our soils are alkaline, and so you're not getting the movement of nutrients. So when you see these green down the centers and the yellow, you know that is iron chlorosis. You can mitigate that with iron treatments to the soil. I would add a whole bunch of leaf mulch on top of those roots to keep them cooler. And I would use a fertilizer probe to inject iron in the soil, and it will work. I've done it in my own house. It absolutely works. When you look at this here and you see those lesions, this is Marsonia or melanospora. This is a fungus, very common in plants. So this is abiotic damage from soils that are too alkaline, that don't allow the movement of nutrients. This is pathogen damage. How can you tell this? You can't until you get that library in your brain of what goes on in the environments we work in. So we're back to our Zimmerman pine moth. Prune out damaged shoots in June before adults emerge. Remove pitch masses. See that pitch mass there? That's where the larvae are feeding. And the nutrients and water can't move, so they broil out to the surface and dry in the sun. Insecticides on the bark in May and August. That's your only management you can do. You can try things like scraping away to expose the galleries and putting in there something like nematodes. You can try that. So here is a dying tree. Now, how do we know this is a dying tree? Again, we don't know if this is abiotic or biotic. It's in the middle of a green space. There's not construction damage. Cars aren't parked on it, causing compaction. So I'm going to assume it's not abiotic. The leaves no distance is really short. You have coppice growth, which is when the xylem gets plugged up, the plant tries to photosynthesize and sends out shoots from the trunk. Never will get better. That is a dying plant. So there is something in here, in this tree, interfering with the movement. So the plant is trying to compensate with this growth, but it's never going to amount to it's never going to refoliate. So I would best say that this is some kind of disease or insect in the soil. If it's a maple, you know it's verticillium. That's a good option to look for. Verticillium, once in the soil, maple is going to die. So here are clear wing borers, which are most common in Minnesota. Nobody seems to know that they're here. This is the cankers, which look like weed whacker damage. This is what we call gummosis. So the larvae feed and the phloem drips because it can't go up, and it drips and it gets dirty from the feces. This is what it looks like when it's new. And so this tells you you have a clear wing borer. If you go up here, you're going to find larvae. The easiest thing is to squirt it with nematodes. And my mom had a tree in front of her house, a viburnum, a Carlisi viburnum, which have these really fragrant flowers. It's a southern plant. And I fixed it. It looked really bad. The cankers were in the bark. And I squirted nematodes every spring, maybe once a month in the summer, peeled the bark away, looked for the larvae, squirted with, and the plant's been there 50 years. It came back. So it does work. But with clear wing borers, the imidacloprid or dinotefuran don't work. And because the adult borers are out through the whole summer, it's hard to spray the bark with permethrin astro or bifentrin Onyx Pro. Here is mistletoe. Now, when you look at that and you haven't seen mistletoe, you can think that's coppice growth. You might think it's some kind of pathogen damage. But again, this is a parasitic plant. And we're understanding more about mistletoe. We think that something introduced a phytoplasm, which is smaller than a virus. It's vectored by leafhoppers. It gets in the phloem and clogs it up. And if it's dwarf mistletoe, you actually will get this. See a plant. It will have berries. This is what people smooch at Christmas time with. But if it's a phytoplasm, it will look like this. So how do you tell? You got to cut off a branch and see, is it a mistletoe or a phytoplasm? So in many cases, tree removal is the only solution because you can get inoculum transferred to another tree. All right, so again, here is that. Why do I have a lot of conifers? Because it's easier to see the damage. Now, who out there says this is insect damage? Wave at me. How many say it's pathogen damage? How many say it's abiotic damage, too cold, too wet, too hot? Well, it's none of those. Conifers every 3 years lose their basal needles and they fall off, and that's what this tree is doing. So you think this is some kind of disease, and it's not. Arborvitaes lose a lot of leaves, a lot of needles. And you want to add compost underneath, some nitrogen to decompose it all, to create acid soils to help the plant. We are not helping these foundation plants. We ignore them in landscapes. It's kind of a crazy thing. We rely on them for structure, but we ignore them. So please start thinking of spending less money on herbicides and more money on managing the soil like they do in organic. So let's go some more diagnosing insect and plant damage. So again, here are Japanese beetle grubs. If I pull the soil away, you're going to see the larval grub sitting there. There's no roots. This is a fake picture because actually they wouldn't be sitting here with no roots. They would be over here. They lay on their back. They wiggle through the soil. They don't like compacted soil. They like good soil to move through. Most people will say, oh, this is Japanese beetle, but this isn't. This is brown patch. Brown patch is caused by rhizoctinia. It's the most common lawn disease you'll see in cool season grasses. It can also affect warm season. It becomes most prolific in around July. Brown patch starts small and is unnoticeable, but quickly it looks like a patch of Japanese beetle. So you got to get in there and dig up the soil, take this to the university plant disease clinic that do mostly pathogens. But until I get in the soil and look, I can't tell you what is what. I mean, I have a gut reaction from doing this for years, but I can't actually tell you what is right. So let's go on with that. This is Pythium blight, and this is brown patch, rhizoctonia. This looks greasy or wet. See the mycelium there? Again, the naive might say this is Japanese beetle. They'll go spray acetylprint, but that won't control it. So Pythium bright initially shows itself as 1 to 3 inch orange colored spots. In some cases, the outer edges are light gray rings. As humidity rises, the spots will grow cob-like fluffy masses of mycelium. The best way to combat Pythium is to use a fungicide containing methephenam. All right, famous in Minnesota, pink and gray snow mold. We didn't have much snow cover this spring, so you didn't see it a lot on house lawns, but you always see it in golf courses and managed turf. And that's the mycelium you see. So fungi have a asexual stage, which is just mycelium, and they have a sexual stage, which you recognize as a mushroom. And this is just the asexual stage with the spores, spreading the spores around. So as temperature warms and the fungus dries out, it will start to disappear. You can rake it to help dry it out and it will be gone. You'll never get rid of it. But again, cultural factors will mitigate whether it's bad or not. But again, you got to get down there and look. You see the mycelium. This could be a fairy ring. You know, fairy rings are, again, the mycelium of a fungus, and then they grow the fruiting bodies. They're usually much bigger. So that's how you tell the difference. Fairy rings mean there's wood under the surface. Somebody buried wood before they built the house or lawn on top of it. We've talked about this one before, and I have this here because they're grubs. You might dig up a flower bed and say, oh, look, I have a grub without no legs. And you might say, oh, it's a black vine weevil. But it may be a billbug. So you got to go off and look at your grass and see if your grass is dying from billbug damage. So everybody here wants to overwinter in soft flower beds, but that doesn't mean they're your pests. So just remember that. Just because you see an insect, it doesn't mean it's your pest. You have to know a little more to sort out who is actually a pest and who's just spending the winter there. All right, we looked at these before, but again, I'm going to focus on global change and different aspects here. And we talked about elm leaf beetle, which comes from Italy. Here's the larvae and the adults feed on elm leaves. We talked about 9-bark beetle. We talked about viburnum beetle. These chrysomellid beetles are easily controlled by this Asian ladybird beetle that was introduced. And so if we want to predict what's going to happen with global change, what they usually say, now there's data from soybeans, that as you have global change and days are warmer, the plants grow more. And so these leaf-feeding beetles, like the corn earworms we saw in the previous talk, you get more of these. But what happens is the soybean uses up the nitrogen in the soil. And so there's a dampening effect. So the insect then has a longer life cycle. It takes longer to turn into an adult because it has less nitrogen. So that's why I say to you, it is really hard for me to predict to you what global change is going to do. I'm going to talk to you about borers. I'm going to tell you in the next few slides. There is no doubt that those clearwing borers, the buprestid borers, the cerambycin borers are going to increase from global change. We looked at these before. We talked about Japanese beetle, exotic from Japan. We've talked about the native with these little granulations here, mass chafer. We've talked about from Javan, oriental beetle. We've talked about this European chafer that's been in the news. And they're called chafer. It's a German word, and it has to do with these antennae. There's antennae. I'm going to go back one. And remember, the antennae of a leaf-feeding beetle equal segments. The antennae of a scarab beetle have these little nets on the edge. So is global change going to increase numbers of these soil inhabiting beetles? I don't think so, because the soil is mitigated from heat and drought. If it's a real drought, yes. If the soil still gets some rain, being in the soil really is a more uniform environment. So I'm going to predict that the soil inhabiting grubs are going to do a little bit better in warmer environments just because they're in the soil. Now, having said that, if it's irrigated turf, there's not going to be any difference. But if it's these people that have houses and let their turf die out, that is the best way to kill these guys. Because when they're eggs and they hatch out in July, August, and you left your turf go dormant, they can't live. So you can do a cultural management to kill grubs, which is not irrigating your soil, just keep it dry. That doesn't work for municipal buildings or, fancy environments that have a lot of aesthetic need for green lawns, golf courses, arboretums, places like that. But there is some madness in Minnesota lawns being brown in the summer. All right, these are the insects that I really want to talk about. The clear-wing borers, the cerambycid beetles, the buprestids. So remember, the cerambycids are longhorn beetles. This is an exotic Asian longhorn beetle. It's always killed off by USDA aphids. This is a twig borer, dogwood twig borer. See the long antennae? It's flat. Sorry. This is elm borer, which is a native. And this is another native milkweed borer. Now, this milkweed borer feeds on leaves. It's kind of weird. So most of these insects, these buprestid and cerambycid borers, the adults do feed on leaves. You're not told that, but they do. It is hard to control them because they're so patchy in what leaves they feed on. To fill a whole canopy with a systemic insecticide to kill them is not going to work. If you're using for emerald ash borer systemic insecticide like ivermectin benzoate, that's going to work against the adults who feed on the leaves. So these guys, as adult feeds on leaves, they go to the bark, they chew a hole. This is what I can tell you for sure is going to increase in Minnesota. And that is a problem because we just went through previously trying to diagnose pathogens from environmental conditions from borers. And you're going to have to get out there and look. And the management is difficult. Cerambycid borers in their later life stages, they go to the heartwood and no insecticides will hit them there. The good thing about buprestid borers like bronze birch borer, two-line chestnut borer, emerald ash borer, is they feed on the phloem right under the bark. So ivermectin benzoate or imidacloprid will work. So we know this as a fact. It's one of the few facts we know about climate change and insects. We know that borers, what happens when a tree is water stressed, is when a larvae chew on inside the trunk of the tree and make a gallery, water goes in the gallery to keep them moist. That water is full of a compound called phenolics. Phenolics are when a leaf falls on the sidewalk and you get that brown color. It binds with protein. It's used in tanning to bind protein so your leather doesn't decompose through time. So tannins are used by trees. They're called polyphenolics. The biggest molecules are tannins. They're used in water as a way to kill insects because they bind, they flood the water. The little insect is sitting in that gallery with the water and they bind in the gut and they prevent the insect from getting any nutrition. We know if a tree is compromised for water, that those phenolics are not induced by the feeding damage and the damage is worse. It's one of the few things we do know. So for instance, in mountain pine beetle, you go out to Mount Rushmore, you go out west and they're talking about, what's going to happen with larch beetle, mountain pine beetle, all these scoliid beetles. They're really high numbers. You see a picture, half the forest is brown. That's going to get worse, which is going to feed fires because there's so much dead wood. That's going to be a huge issue. So we know that under drought, the borers are going to do much better, whether it's a clear wing borer or these cerambycid borers, these round-headed borers, or these buprestid borers. These make a D-shaped exit hole. They're called flat-headed borers because their head is flat. We go back, the cerambycid borers are called round-headed borers because their head are round. They're also called longhorn beetles because they have long antennae. So cerambycidae, round-headed borers, or longhorn beetles. Buprestidae, flat-headed metallic borers, or metallic wood-boring beetles. All of these have the potential to increase from drought from increasing climate change, because water with these phenolics is what kills them. And with drought, you can't have these phenolics flooding the gallery. So we know that is a real issue. And these borers are really common. So I hope from today, you've gotten that there's three major groups of borers: the clear-wing moth borers, the buprested borers, and the cerambycid borers. And then there are some weevils, borers like black vine weevil. And we saw that other weevil borer that gets into grass. All right. So again, here's our clingworm borer. Here's the fat little larvae. You're going to get nematodes injected in there. It will go up the galleries and it will kill them. This is the frass. So Ceciidae, clearwing borers. Look at all the hosts: alder, ash, birch, dogwood, fir, lilac, hawthorn, mountain ash, maple, oak, pine, poplar, sycamore, viburnum, willow, fruit trees, apricot, cherry, peach, plum. Completely unrecognized by a lot of landscapers. So here is what the adults look like. Look at these long antennae. That is a butterfly. Does that look like a butterfly to you? It's in the order Lepidoptera, family Ceciidae. They land on the bark and they lay eggs and they chew a hole in the bark just like all the other buprestids do. And they lay eggs in the bark. And they cause the eggs hatch out and they cause that damage. So see, it says moth borer larvae feed under bark, adults do not feed, chlorosis, wilting, dieback, many deciduous trees. So it's really hard unless you look for those galleries, which look just like weed whipping galleries, to sort out what's there. Here's a different species of clearwing borer. Here's just some other pictures. Here's another species of clearwing borer. The problem is that most of them emerge May, June. This banded ash borer emerges in August. They have one generation a year, but it's like impossible to time a pesticide application. They have little legs. They're borers, but they have little legs. Most of the other borers don't. But it is really hard to kill them with pesticides because of the timing. Imidacloprid or dinotefuran does not work against them. So the best things that people in the East Coast, if you have a prize tree that has borers, are these nematodes you inject. Okay, so here is our Zimmerman borer, and it looks, has little legs on it. It looks like a clearwing borer larvae. So here's a clearwing borer, and here is the Zimmerman borer galleries. Here's a little Zimmerman borer. So they look very similar. If you put them, plop them down in front of me, they both have reduced legs, but have legs. And I would only know the difference because the clearwing borers like to be down by the trunk. Sometimes they go up on the higher branches, but the Zimmerman pine moth, most of the time they're on the higher branches. And again, you can put sticky traps. You can try to spray permethrin on the bark, but nematodes would work the best for them. They are very difficult to control. Here is an adult, you're never going to see it. As I said, there's many species. They all fly at different times. We have not had a good deal. Here is all the damage from, they're always, an adult will always lay multiple eggs. So even though you see one moth, that doesn't mean there's one causing all this damage. And here's the pile of frass from eating the xylem and phloem. All right, so we want to end up trying to talk about climate change. And as you can imagine, there's a huge literature out there on the effects of climate change on insects. And I'm going to just make it short in the beginning here to tell you we don't know. We know borers are going to get worse because of the way, what is controlling them, and that's mitigated by drought. So without the drought, the water being able to flood the cells with the larvae, no matter if it's a bark beetle borer, a clearwing borer, a buprestid borer, a cerambycid borer, that's going to have the same issues. So minimal vegetation with lower diversity. So insect destructive environmental features. So this is what's going to happen. Heat islands are creating hotter roots for trees. The tree roots are their hearts, just like we saw in those pictures of those arborvitae. If the roots get heat up, then the tree is gone. A lack of water bodies, too tidy an environment, not enough of mulch or leaf litter, regular pesticide and fertilizer use, all of those are going to increase insect abundance. What can you do to reduce insect issues, cultural issues for insects? You can increase diversity of plants. So there's more plants out there that provide pollen and nectar and structure for insects to overwinter in. You can make denser vegetation under trees, rain gardens, because insects need those places to hide for the winter. Reduce pavement porosity. Increase pavement porosity. Don't put sealers on top so water can move in. So we have a problem with too much water, and standing water kills roots. Too little water kills roots. Wild plants are more adapted to these fluctuations, so have a balance of native and heirloom plants, balance between herbs, shrubs, and trees. The more leaf litter, the more herbaceous plants on top of the roots of a tree, the better it's going to do in a drought. Rely on biocontrol. Plant these bee lawns, these rain gardens to supply pollen and nectar. And stop using all these herbicides and chemicals to kill weed. Put down some fertilizer, put your mulch on top, no plastic. You're adding the fertilizer so the mulch, as it decomposes, doesn't take the nutrients out of the soil. And that covering of the roots is going to be a big help. So it's just saying this cultural management here. This cultural management can help support good bugs. So it's kind of, you're looking at this and you're saying, oh, it's going to increase insects and I'm going to have more pest problems. Remember, there are no factors that affect just good bugs or bad bugs. They affect all bugs. And so we're assuming that the more bugs you have, you'll have more good and bad bugs. And that will lead to a healthier environment, especially in landscapes. So here again, I just used a couple research papers. The gradual long-term change, warming, reduced seasonality. The impact is range shifts. So insects that, like European corn borer that attacks corn that has to come up from the south, that may start to overwinter here. The phenology of the plants, so what plants come out at what seasonal time, which affects what nectar and pollen are available. It affects what insects can feed on them. That's definitely going to change the phenology of when plants flower and break bud. Species interactions are going to change because if you, for some reason, some environmental change is more detrimental to predators and parasitoids, you're going to see pest outbreaks. We've been seeing a lot of extreme effects, extreme rainfall, fire, temperature, drought. All of these affect insects just as they do people. And so the bottom line is insects are going to decline. Intervention would be management, public perception, bee lawns, rain gardens, not using herbicides. And intervention, would be less stressors, trying to have more persistence and trying to keep those ecosystem services going of beneficial insects that kill pests and butterflies and bees. And remember, a lot of these insects are food for songbirds, they're food for hawks. And if you start losing insects in forests and naturalized areas, you're going to make a severe decline in insectivorous birds. So we saw this one earlier, as I said, we don't know, except we do know with borers that they're going to increase. There's increased number of generations, expansion, more outbreak of diseases, increased overwintering survival, decreased synchrony of insects and their host. So this has to do with phenology. The plants start growing. Are the predators getting the right cues? The predators and parasitoids that control the insect getting the right cues? Is the ground warming up right so they emerge at the same time as the pests? And that's the loss of synchrony. So this loss of synchrony, these two down here, are the biggest concern of entomologists. So there are predictions of how different parameters. So as we increase carbon, what happens is it alters this carbon-nitrogen ratio, and leaves have less nitrogen, which, as I said earlier with soybeans, causes greater consumption. But the plants have less nitrogen, so it takes longer to develop. There is a decrease in pest abundance because some of them are not making it to adult because they don't have as much food. But it is usually the predators and parasitoids, not the pest insects. It's usually those that have to deal with the synchrony with their host. Rainfall, changes in precipitation. We know drought is going to affect borers. It makes more plants susceptible. We know that. Heavy precipitation, insects wash away, decreased overwintering because the water is soil logged. So rainfall is going to affect good bugs and bad bugs. So this is just a schematic of elevated CO2 changes plant metabolism. So they grow faster, but they don't have as much nitrogen, so they're not the same quality food. VOCs are volatiles that are used by insects to find their plant, and they are affected by CO2. So good bugs that attack pests can find their host plants, and they can find the plants. So we know that is an issue that biocontrol will have problems. Elevated temperature also increases plant metabolism. It increases these VOCs here. CO2 decreases it because the plant has less nutrients. VOCs are a byproduct of plant health, so you have less here. But if you just elevate temperatures, you have more. But as the plants grow faster, you're going to use up soil nitrogen. So VOCs will eventually go down. So people are trying to figure out schemes, although it is only for borers that we understand the real effects. And this is the big issue, the effects on plant, insect, predators, parasitoids. These predators or parasitoids are what control pests in nature. And as we go through problems with plant phenology, plant growth, different times, if plants are stressed, the length of the corolla tube changes, and some bees and butterflies can't feed from this. These VOCs, these attractiveness change, so insects can't find their host plants. All of these are just some ways: spatial mismatchment, temporal mismatchment, morphological mismatchment, VOCs, recognition mismatchment. All of these are ways that this plant, insect, predator, parasitoid interactions will be changed. And this one just goes on to another level to talk about it, the effects of CO2-induced photosynthesis and stomata conductance. So I just put this in here because it's at a level you wouldn't usually think of. We planted ash trees, green ash, white ash, because in the heat of the summer, their roots are in these boxes, you know, these heat islands. And what they do to survive is they close their stoma and they just don't photosynthesize, and they sit there until the environment. So that's why we overplanted ash. And so what this model talks about is how elevated CO2 and better carbon grain, the effect on plant growth, how all of this just through photosynthesis and stomata opening and closing are going to affect plant insect interactions. So people are trying to model this, but besides the borers, I can say there's not a good understanding, except that we know invasive species will spread north because climate kept them out of Minnesota, the cold weather, the dry winters, and hopefully the predators and parasitoids will be here to kill them, but the models say they are more affected by plant phenology, and that mismatch is going to cause asynchrony of emergence in the natural enemies. So all in all, everybody thinks in agriculture, pest numbers are going to increase and control by natural predators and parasitoids are going to decrease, and there's going to be increased reliance on pesticides, which isn't good. So stay tuned for more information on this. Thank you very much, and sorry I can't be there. I'll meet with you next time.
All right, good stuff.
All right, so let's see.